On February 7, 1497, in the heart of Renaissance Italy, something incredible happened. A group of young men stood in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence and began burning piles of luxury goods, artworks and beautiful clothes in a massive bonfire. And it wasn't just some random act of vandalism. There was a whole lot more going on here. So what happened in Florence all those years ago? Why did they burn so much beautiful stuff? What does it mean for us today? And how can we learn from one of history's strangest moments? Let's find out. So imagine you're an excited young man living in Renaissance Florence, also known as the birthplace of the Renaissance. This is a time when art, science and culture are flourishing, and people are just starting to rediscover ancient Greek and Roman texts. But life isn't all sunshine and rainbows. Despite this explosion of creativity, there's a growing concern among some about the direction society is taking. There's a feeling that the values of the past, particularly Christian values, are being forgotten. And this sentiment is only made worse by the recent death of influential and beloved Medici patriarch Lorenzo de' Medici. His son, Piero, is seen as a weak leader, and many resent the family's immense wealth and power. With Carnival just around the corner, a time for feasting and general debauchery, these troubled youths are looking for an outlet for their frustration. They've had enough of the Medici family and the decadence of the Florentine elite, and they want to show their disapproval. And then they have a brainwave. Why not burn everything that symbolizes sin and excess in a massive bonfire? They start gathering items associated with vanity and luxury, perfume bottles, dice, elegant clothing, and anything else they deem decadent. And then they take it to the Piazza della Signoria, the main square in Florence, and start throwing everything into a giant bonfire. News of this bizarre event spreads quickly throughout the city, and soon thousands have gathered to watch. And this was only the beginning. As the night wore on, the crowds grew increasingly frenzied and began targeting items associated with paganism, alchemy, fortune-telling, and astrology. Ancient statues of gods like Mercury and Venus were hurled into the flames, along with astrolabes, dice, cosmetics, and musical instruments. Even books on classical mythology and poetry weren't safe. As dawn approached, the square was littered with the remains of over 2,000 items. But who were the instigators of this strange behavior? The ringleaders of this mob were members of a secretive society known as the Papellani, or commoners, and driving the movement was a charismatic monk named Girolamo Savonarola. Born in 1452, Savonarola was an Italian Dominican friar, preacher, and a controversial political figure. His radical sermons attacking the Medici and the clergy earned him both admirers and enemies. While he never married, he had a charismatic personality and was known for his ability to connect with ordinary people. In fact, his sermons attracted huge crowds in the Piazza della Signoria, where he would rant against the immorality of the ruling class and criticize the Medici family for their extravagance and corruption. Before long, Savonarola found himself at odds with the authorities, and he was summoned to Rome to answer for his controversial views. However, he returned to Florence a hero after making a miraculous recovery from what was thought to be a lethal illness, and shortly after, Savonarola's star began to rise. When Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492, the mantle of leadership passed to his son Piero. But unlike his father, Piero lacked political skills and was unable to maintain Florence's delicate balance of power. This led to instability and unrest, creating the perfect atmosphere for Savonarola's message to take root. By the mid-1490s, Savonarola had established a devoted following known as the Weepers, named after his frequent calls for people to weep for the sins of the world. They admired his fiery sermons and his calls for reform. These mostly young men would gather in secret and carry out acts of vandalism against symbols of Florence's decadence. But it wasn't just Savonarola's charisma that drew them to him. It was also his message. He spoke to them about the need for repentance and the dangers of secularism, which resonated deeply with many young Florentines. However, things really started to get heated when Savonarola set his sights on the Medici family. As I mentioned earlier, he saw them as corrupt and immoral and frequently denounced them in his sermons. This created a dangerous divide in the city, pitting the people against the Medici and turning Florence into a powder keg ready to explode. And when the time came, it was the bonfire of the Vanities that would light the match. Now, you might be wondering why they called this event the Bonfire of the Vanities instead of simply the bonfire. Well, the name comes from an essay written by an English philosopher named Richard Burton. He used the term Great Instauration to describe the purification of Florence, which later became known as the Bonfire of the Vanities. The term alludes to the idea that the burning of luxury items represented a purging of vanity and excess from society. So back to our story. As the crowd gathered in the Piazza della Signoria, there was an overwhelming sense of excitement and anticipation. People from all walks of life were united in their desire to express their frustration and opposition to the Medici. Savonarola stood before them, his words echoing through the square as he urged them to abandon their sinful ways and embrace a life of piety and reform. The response was thunderous. Thousands of voices rose, chanting, "Fire, fire, burn them all." And then it began. People began throwing objects into the fire, each item symbolizing a different aspect of Florentine decadence. Perfumes and cosmetics were seen as emblems of vanity. Books on paganism and poetry were tossed in, representing the rejection of classical learning. Musical instruments were cast aside, symbolizing the abandonment of worldly pleasures. Clothing and jewels were burnt, signifying the renunciation of material wealth. To the crowd, this wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a necessary act of purification. By ridding themselves of these symbols of excess, they believed they were purging their city of sin and corruption. But while this might seem like a harmless act of youthful exuberance, it was anything but. In many ways, it was a precursor to the religious fervor that would sweep Europe in the coming centuries. The Bonfire of the Vanities wasn't just a protest against the Medici or a condemnation of secularism. It was a full-blown rejection of the Renaissance ideals that had dominated Florence for decades. As the flames grew higher and the crowd's fervor intensified, the true nature of this rebellion became clear. It was a clash between two worlds, the flourishing Renaissance culture and the rising tide of religious fanaticism. For many, this was a pivotal moment, a chance to reject the decadence and excess that had come to define their city. But for others, it was a disturbing display of intolerance and religious zeal. In the end, the Bonfire of the Vanities had far-reaching consequences for Florence. It marked the decline of the Medici's power and the end of the Renaissance era in Florence. It also led to Savonarola's rise to prominence and his eventual execution in 1498 after he was charged with heresy. But perhaps most importantly, it highlighted the growing tension between traditional religious values and the new ideas and values of the Renaissance. This conflict would play out over the next few centuries, shaping the course of European history. So what does the Bonfire of the Vanities mean for us today? Well, it's a reminder of the dangers of religious extremism and the importance of protecting intellectual freedom. It's also a testament to the power of ideas and the impact they can have on society. Savonarola's message of reform and his condemnation of the Medicis resonated with many Florentines, leading to this dramatic and unprecedented event. Ultimately, the Bonfire of the Vanities is a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting religious fervor take over reason and moderation. So do you think Savonarola was a hero or a villain? And how do you think the Bonfire of the Vanities would have turned out if it hadn't been put down? Share your thoughts with me in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this one. Thanks for watching. Bye.